Welcome, gentle friend. Let the world around you quieten. Let your eyelids feel soft and heavy as we draw back the heavy wooden doors of time and step together through the hush of ancient stone. Tonight, we explore the history of the Tithe barn, those giant barns built in the medieval age to store the church's 10% tax. A story of solemn architecture of obligation, held in moss-laced walls and whispered echoes. Close your eyes, if they wish, and breathe slowly like the gentle symphony of straw shifting underfoot. Imagine a vast structure rising from dew-damp earth. Gray blue lias and Cotswold stone walls, buttressed evenly, as if shaped by unseen hands to bear centuries of weight. This is a medieval barn-moor cathedral, an barn rising from the fields to serve as a silent sentinel over the tithe. In medieval Europe, the church woven into every village's life requested a tithe, 10% of a farmer's crops, their livestock, their labor. This church tithe was no mere donation. It was an obligation, ordained, solemn, and nationally enforced. To house this abundant harvest, communities built the tithe barn, the architectural result of obligation and duty. Our journey this evening will unfold slowly, moment by moment, through these barns' origins, their architecture, their life with the seasons, the people who tended them, and their quiet decline. We will not hurry. Each rendered detail, each soft syllable, like stone against stone, will settle into your mind. We move now through centuries of quiet labor and gentle purpose. The roots of tithing in early medieval Europe reach back into spiritual soil, where faith, law, and agrarian life entwined in quiet, enduring harmony. One might begin with the councils of the 6th century, the Council of Tours in 567, and the Third Council of Macon in 585, where church tithe was not merely suggested but codified, with penalties such as excommunication set against those who refused to give. In these councils, the ecclesiastic rulers pronounced that paying 1/10 of one's harvest, a predial tithe, was imperative, binding spiritual charity and social obedience. By the 8th century, secular rulers had woven this 10% tax into civil tapestry. Charlemagne's capitularies granted the church the right to tithes across his empire, merging piety with fiscal policy. Thus, the tithe barna structure, whose simple name belied its grand purpose, was born of spiritual giving and economic necessity. Built from the 12th century onward, these barns used medieval architecture to house the aggregate of rural obligation. As David Hewitt writes, tithe barns were used to store the produce and other goods that farmers were legally required to give to the church once a year, and were used consistently for over 700 years across northern Europe, enduring into the 19th century. Before their stone walls rose, though, farmers themselves lived the tithe intimately. Let us step into a peat clement countryside in 10th century England, where the Maxwell family, Nicholas Maxwell the father, his wife Edith, and their 2 young children ritualized the 10% harvest in twilight and early light. Their small cottage was nestled beside a meadow where barley and rye stood knee-high. Each dawn, they walked fields heavy with dew and distant birdsong, fellowship and labor interwoven by call and response. When harvest time neared, Nicholas organized the bundles rye stalks grouped in tens. From each 10, he extracted one to the predial tithe. Each sheaf was tied with cord, made from hemp grown on their own modest plot. Edith separated dairy, a measured amount of milk, a wheel of soft cheese for the mixed tithe, while their eldest daughter, Matilda, set aside lamb's wool and personal filings for the personal tithe that supported the parish priest. Behind every such mortal act of tithing lay legal authority. In England, kings like Edmund I and Edgar in the 10th century decreed that non-compliance could bring ecclesiastical punishment, while the Doomsday Book recorded land productivity and expected tithe share, rendering each piece of land subject to taxation. Indeed, non-payment might see a household excommunicated or fined, certainly unwelcome sanctions in a deeply religious time. Our fictional Maxwell family followed a precise ritual. Gathered tithe portions were loaded into a modest cart and rolled along rutted lanes toward the local tithe barn near the church. As they passed church lanes and sentinels, sometimes even comforting crosses, they carried not only goods, but an embodied testimony of faith and obligation. Each tithe barn lay under the silent watch of stone buttresses and aisled barn architecture, which we will explore more deeply later, but now serve as solemn background to their tangible gestures. Inside the barn, light diffused through narrow louvered openings. Dust motes hung, drifting like spirits among the stale straw. The Maxwells handed each bag to the clerk, who weighed the wheat on balanced brass scales and noted details in a ledger. 1 bean, 1 denarius, 1 sheaf each recorded. This quiet exchange, nearly silent, but for the brass clasp, the whisper of pages, and the cleric's low voice, marked the community's thanksgiving and its duty. That night, the family returned to their smoke-blackened hearth, where Edith simmered gruel with lentil and barley. The meal tasted more satisfying once the 10% tax had been delivered. There was spiritual comfort in the offering, as though their crops had been partly consecrated to divine purpose. In one rhythm, part nurtured their family, part served their faith, a solemn symmetry of giving and receiving. This previal tithe was the simplest grain and field produce. But the tithe system included mixed tithes raising livestock yields like milk, wool, and veal and personal tithes, including labor or wages. Mixed tithes might be paid year-round, but flagship tithing was the autumn deliverance to the parish, or to a nearby monastic barn if the church was controlled by an abbey. Indeed, for complex farmers, tithing was inseparable from seigneurial and manorial obligations. They owed labor rents plowing, mowing, harvesting to their lord, and tithe to the church. The combination could amount to more than 50% of total output, particularly in lean years. That fact made timely, accurate delivery essential. Failing to tithe on time or in full could result in harsh penalties, church censure, secular fines, or social stigma. Across Europe, variations existed. In early medieval Ireland, church jurists argued over whether tithes of cattle and crops were in fact annual obligations or special first fruits, but counting animals still fell under tithe collection. In Spain, the diezmo followed a three-way division and sometimes exceeded 10% on certain goods, but regional governors could usurp the share, turning tithe into a tool of royal or noble extraction. Within rural England, tithing units or tithings, consisting of 10 households, ensured collective accountability through frank pledge systems. A tithing man oversaw the obligation of each household, who might now owe tithe. His enforcement carried the moral weight of local oversight, not only church decree. Through successive centuries, the tithe system and its barns remained. Even after the Tithe Commutation Act of 1836, which replaced payment in kind with money, tithe barns stayed as physical markers. Some converted to other uses, others left empty, and a few preserved by heritage trusts. But in our field vista in the 10th century, the Maxwell family's barn was part of daily life. Its stacked sacks safe against fox and fowl, its flagged threshing floor smooth with history. Consider the value of that quiet act. The collected sheaf was not monumental, yet symbolic. One of 10, offered, weighed, recorded its sharing held together social structure, legal authority, religious devotion. The barn was not only storage, but sanctuary home to the promise that nobody would starve in winter, because the church had gathered enough grain to feed dozens, if not hundreds. Pause, take a gentle breath. Imagine dew on barley. Feel the sway of the cart's axle. Hear softly the dusty floorboards beneath sticky hay. Sense the clerk's ledger closing with a resonant thud. Inhale that mingled scent of straw, sweat, wheat, and stone. In tracing this lived experience, we uncover the humble dignity of medieval life. The tithe barn slow to rise from soon forgotten plans was the endpoint of an ancient lineage of giving. Its walls held more than grain. They held the collision of divine decree and earthly endeavor. They held the collective sigh of a community fulfilling its quiet contract with heaven. In subsequent chapters, we will walk into the barns themselves to examine their architecture with cruck trusses, raised roofs, aisled structure, and stone buttresses. But here, in this first chapter, we have encountered the roots, the earliest whispers of duty, the mathematics of giving, the lived ritual of the stakeholders, not clergy, not lords, but peasant families bound by custom, faith, subsistence, and law. And so, dear listener, let your heartbeat settle to that slow pastoral pace. In each breath, you mirror a medieval farmer. Inhale abundance, exhale offering, inhale family, exhale community. Tomorrow, or rather, later in our journey, we will enter the barn's interior, where architecture itself speaks, flourished by those humble beginnings. For now, rest in the afterglow of duty. The field lies still under breezy calm, the barn doors closed against cold, the air muted but secure. You are in a world shaped by slow ritual and stone, and by shared responsibility. Let your eyelids drift, your mind settles. In early medieval Europe, the transformation of the tithe system required not just ritual and routine, but also a tangible architectural response. Thus emerged the practice of constructing monumental storage spaces, tithe barns built in relative silence across centuries, growing in scale and refinement from about the 12th century. This chapter unfolds the slow, deliberate process by which these structures took shape, from the choice of curved oak, trees for cruck blade trusses, to the hewing of stone buttresses and construction of raised cruck roofs. Their builders, anonymous carpenters, and masons operated in hushed communion with materials and purpose. The hallmark of many tithe barns was the cruck truss, a structural pairing of two naturally curved timbers, often oak, split to create symmetrical blades. These curved beams were sourced from mature trees with branching profiles suited to vault-like spans. Carving began at forest edges or woodland clearings. Skilled hands squared each timber lengthwise, then halved it to yield cruck blade and companion. These blades were raised, often using ropes and simple pulleys, until their tops met at an apex, shimmed and joined with a horizontal tie beam or collar. The result was a Gothic-like arch sturdy and purpose-built. The base cruck, whose blades terminated at masonry walls, allowed barns to soar spaciously without interior columns disrupting storage space. It was a design both practical and quietly powerful. Some barns, like those stewarded by Beaulieu Abbey, used raised cruck roofs, where cruck blades shifted upward onto masonry, creating storage-level basements below. As crucks were fitted, mortise and tenon joints, sometimes dovetailed, as noted in Worcestershire studies, were locked together with wooden pegs, each join reflecting medieval carpentry's harmonious engineering. In some barns, jointed cruck variants featured upper collars anchoring arcade plates to resist roof rotation underweight delicate details refined over centuries. These subtle adaptations speak of master carpenters evolving vernacular timber framing into majestic, weight-bearing structures. Once the cruck frames formed skeletal arches inside the barn, purlins, rafters, and ridge poles were laid across them, creating a lattice framework. In more refined barns, such as Great Coxwell, triple purlin systems were used. 3 parallel horizontal timbers for robust support. These were nestled into the cruck structure at regular intervals, reinforced by wind-bracing beams, creating a quiet network of resilience and grace. Outside, massive stone buttresses were added to support the masonry wall's outward thrust from the timber roof. Built of dense Cotswold stone or blue lias, these buttresses were spaced along walls at intervals aligned with interior bays. Their presence gave the barns a cathedral-like solidity, yet spoke only in shadow and moss. At Great Coxwell, squat ashlar buttresses anchor long runs of rubble-backed Cotswold stone, mounting the barn's 152-foot-long wall with quiet strength. Aisle barns, another common form, used interior timber arcade posts supporting longitudinal beams or arcade plates, which in turn supported the purlins. This created 3 zones, central nave and narrower aisles, resembling small-scale church plans. The aisle design originated from royal halls and market buildings, adapted here for agricultural purpose, to admit horse-drawn carts directly into the nave via gabled porches. Such porches were precise in proportion, enabling fully laden vehicles to enter and unload in a single motion, using the barn's cross-draft to winnow grain. Stone walls rose from plinths of rubble or brick to ensure dry interiors in winter. Ancient pegs and lavender mortar kept them warm, while small air vents, unusual cruciform slits, or slit lights admitted owls, permitting natural pest control. Openings at gables or each porch allowed carts and staff to enter from dusk into dawn-silent passages, preserving grain from rain or overexposure. For roof coverings, local materials were used. In limestone regions, thin Stonesfield slates, weighing nearly 70 tons on some barns, were laid in courses. Their heaviness required durable caulking, closely tied rafters, and precise beam spacing. In marsh or woodland areas, thatch or reed roofs were used instead, offering lighter but still weather-resistant covering. The Abbotsbury Great Barn in Dorset, one of the world's longest thatched buildings, exemplifies these regional adaptations. Inside, spacers and pegged battens held roof materials secure. Historic repairs revealed hidden collars and trusses beneath modern finishes. Builders sometimes reused timbers from older structures, a form of medieval recycling ensuring continuity of material and memory. Even centuries later, dendrochronology could fingerprint felling seasons. Great Coxwell's timbers, cut in winter, 1291 to 92, testify to the medieval weather pattern and harvest cycles. In barns built entirely of timber, especially Eastern England or Northern Germany, the timber-framed Tithe barn variant featured oak, post, and beam walls with wattle and daub filling, or later, brick and fill. These offered clearer spans without a need for buttressing. though roof structures still echoed the cruck or collar beam form. Cruck barns were relatively rare in southeast Britain, but more common in northwest and Wales, likely due to the presence of naturally curved pedunculate oak, conducive to cruck design. In regions with these trees, skilled carpenters could source perfect arched timbers, earthing A-frame arcs rising from floor to ridge, bearing heavy roof loads. Over centuries, cruck blades shaped landscapes more profoundly than ashlar masonry in quieter places. Construction often involved monastic carpenters. Beaulieu Abbey's lime estate employed teams to fell, trim, and raise oak for Great Coxwell. Local woods were felled in winter to reduce shrinkage and warping, then laid green, causing future tightening of joints. Similarly, Lee Court Barn in Worcestershire, built in 1344 for Pershore Abbey, was constructed entirely in timber, using base cruck frames, each cruck pair forming an independent bent, and connected by purlins and tie beams to form an unbroken barn. The slow raising of the roof was ceremonial in its own silent way. After days of jointing, the full cruck arch would be levered upright, set onto padstones or on masonry plinths, and pegged in place. Scaffold holes left visible in the stone walls remained as testimony to the craftspeople's elevated platforms. In winter, hoisted beams cut silvery against low sun-silent milestones in the barn's skeleton taking shape. Once roofing was complete, gutters and downpipes, simple stone or wooden, were added. Occasionally, rainwater was channeled into external drains to avoid undermining foundations. There were no gutters as we know them. Rather, drip-molded stones above openings and gradual eaves overhangs kept interior spaces dry. All this quietly ensured that grain remained safe through wet winters. The finishing touch, heavy oak doors, sometimes carved with construction dates or benefactor initials, were hung on iron strap hinges. These doors, set into squared openings, could be braced with diagonal boarding and ledged with stone thresholds, absorbing years of impact without audible protest. By the time a tithe barn was finished, the roof settled, walls aged gray, doors weathered to silvery brown. The building stood in silent readiness. It offered hundreds of cubic yards of dry storage, lit only by corner windows and filtered light through louvers. The floors were spread with clean straw, the internal beams high enough to permit stacking grain bags on pallets or wagons to unload directly. These barns were built in silence, under church authority, by laborers whose names were seldom recorded. Orders came from monastic granges or parish clergy, funding by tithes and rents. Mechanics of midwinter forest clearing, summer raising, autumn completion worked in harmony with farm cycles. Many such barns, after dissolution or changing ownership, were adapted but retained structural bones. Today, visitors standing inside Great Coxwell feel edges of vaulted space between timber and stone, hearing only distant wind and passing birds. The architecture speaks of silence. No soaring stained glass, but quiet buttresses and simple cruck curves holding space. The barn built in silence continues its speech, a slow meditation on obligation, shape, and craft. In the next chapter, we will step inside, explore the barn's rhythm of use in the seasons, how communities entered, measures were taken, and harvest turned from field to storehouse. But for now, listen deeply to the timber, stone, and earth in stillness. Let the outline of the cruck frame shape your breathing lift, hold, and gently lower. You are safe here, under walls that have stored a century's worth of tithe and stillness. As the wheel of the year turns, the medieval countryside adjusts to the changing seasons, gently weaving a tapestry of atmosphere and labor. With the first soft breath of spring, when the damp fragrances of thawing earth reach into every furrow of the field, the Tithe barn stands ready, its thick stone walls still cool after their winter hibernation. This ancient structure, rooted to the soil with stone buttresses and crowned by a lofty, timber-framed raised cruck roof, holds more than grain. It holds time, quiet time, epical time, a rhythm as slow and regular as your own breath as you drift in darkness. Each season calls forth different duties, small rituals that carry us forward from dormancy to harvest, from yield to storage, from abundance to preservation. In spring, when the fields are still wet with frost melt and green is newly bright, the barn's vast doors are mostly shuttered. Inside, the air is faintly musty with leftover grain dust and lingering cold. That dust has been settled for months since the previous harvest, when the barn brimmed with wheat, rye, oats, barley, legumes, wool, and such. Now, as life returns to pasture and plow, there is little demand on the barn space, but much latent energy in its walls. The threshing floor, a special flagged section near one end, lies dormant. This is the area where, in late summer, cereal stalks were spread, beaten until grain fell free, and the heavy tread of oxen or the sound of flails echoed. In spring, families harvest early garden produce, but that remains near the cottage. The barn's life is still ahead, though its hushed presence reminds villagers that the cycle is never ending. By late spring, cleaning begins. Stone floors are swept. Straw is removed from corners and ditches. Church custodians walk the aisles, checking for signs of pests, for owl droppings, for worn timbers. A few shingles of moss are lifted. Wooden pegs of the cruck truss are inspected. The barn shows signs of age. Slight timbers shrink. Settling dust motes swirl in daylight, but remain sound, its geometry ready for the autumnal bounty. These chores are not vibrant or breathtaking. They are methodical and soothing. They repeat each year with slight variations of wind and light, offering a soft reassurance that the structure endures for centuries, as long as someone cares enough to sweep, to inspect, to maintain. Through the heat of summer, the barn's stone walls absorb sunlight. Inside, the temperature stays cooler than the fields, a sanctuary from the midday sun. This lull, this stillness, makes the barn feel temporal, a bridge between handfuls of dust and thousands of bushels. In many regions, summer storms stir the air. Occasionally, a thunderclap shakes the rafters, and villagers close the shutters to protect stored goods from sudden downpours. Yet often, even as fields are swaying in wheat gold, the barn remains unused. If spring cleaning revealed minor, structural issues like a broken rafter or a slipped slate, it is during summer that small repairs are planned. Time and weather permitting, a group of villagers will haul fresh stone from nearby quarries or sharpen pitchfork points to brace beams. A master carpenter might inspect beam joints, ensuring the tenon and mortise connections stay firm, lest winter storm winds threaten the roof. Summer, in the barn, is a pause filled with low hums, insects buzzing in crevices, rooks nesting overhead, the distant clatter of fieldwork beyond the walls. When the golden autumn arrives, the Tithe barn begins to stir with purpose. It is time for harvest, the long-awaited culmination of a year's work. In early September, the fields are ripening. Wheat heads nod with kernels, barley gleams with amber. Villagers cut by hand or with sickle. gathering bundles of grain into stooks that arch in the breeze. Many families set aside their tithe. The churches imposed 10% tax, measured in grain, hay, fruit, wool. These tithe portions are carefully collected. Farmers bind sheaves into 10s or 20s, then pluck one out of every 10, neatly tied with straw or rope. Mixed tithes, milk, cheese, wool, even apples are bundled separately. Each tenth is carefully measured because the tithe barn will demand precision. The entire valley is filled with the smell of hay and earth, mixed in with the promise of cold winter meals. As dusk falls, the grain is placed upon wagons and straw-lined carts drawn by oxen. In the murmur of twilight, loaded carts trundle toward the tithe barn. That first night of delivery, the giant oak doors, each panel nearly as tall as a person, are creaked open. A hush falls inside. The barn's interior, lit by thin shafts of dusk light or small flickering lanterns, is a cathedral of grain. The aisled barn space, supported by central lines of timber posts rising to the triple purlin, cruck truss roof, seems endless. Farmers wheel in sacks, placid oxen flicking their tails. The smell of fresh wheat, of oats, of barley, drifts. The threshing floor is swiped clean, ready to receive new grain. Carefully, clerks take brass scales shining cold and weigh each bag, a heavy ritual of obligation complete. For each accepted tithe, a token weight is thrust into a ledger. Some barns had locksmiths' keys symbolizing accountability. In one famous example at Bradford-on-Avon, 21 keys were used, 2 just for the barn's porches. The barn was more than storage. It was trust, accountability, and communal ritual in stone and wood. As late autumn deepens, deliveries continue, especially after each field's harvest. The barn begins to fill. Stacks of wheat stand on pallets. Barley is piled in corners. Sacks of pulses are arranged neatly. Seasonal workers might remain late to help unload as dusk arrives earlier. In the evenings, the door threshold becomes a bench. Villagers sit with a cup of ale, talking low about yields, the upcoming winter, church offerings. These conversations, drifting in waves, seem to ripple the dust in the rafters, though nothing stirs but the steady rhythm of breaths, of grain, of obligation. Outside, geese migrate in V-shaped flights. Inside, the barn holds the abundant silence of season. With the first frost, the barn is all but full. Deliveries cease. The caretakers close the doors tight. Inside, grain breathes, settles, compresses. Hay scent blends with the more subtle aroma of stored cereals. This is the barn in winter, the cold heart of its purpose. Winter light peeks through louvered vents and narrow window openings. These were sometimes shaped to allow owls to enter and aid in pest control, a natural insect defense. The barn becomes a safe house. Mice and rats may attempt invasion. Keeper cats patrol. Occasional packs of smoke drift in from a nearby hearth used by the barn keeper, warming the air slightly. It is practical, not dramatic. Caretakers make weekly rounds, checking moisture, dust, bird droppings, animal tracks. The grain depreciation, the slow spoilage or infestation, is ever a concern. Some storage costs are inherent barn fees. Depreciation, guard wages, opportunity cost. In medieval England, storage expenses could reach nearly 30% per year, matched by the high interest and spoilage risk of the period. But inside that hush, the grain sleeps, the barn stands resolute, knowing that inside it lies survival. When midwinter arrives, December, January, the The barn is bathed in gray light, sometimes glowing from snow-reflected opal. No deliveries are made. Instead, minor movements occur. The priest or caretaker may open small hatches to remove a sack of barley or oats for animal feed. Occasionally, sheep need oats or cows alfalfa, and the barn yields carefully. Each removal is weighed, recorded, the ledger updated. The barn, so full in autumn, now begins to mellow. Slight creaking echoes as walls contract in cold. That sound, mysterious and slow, is comforting a living memory of timber, adjusting, returning, existing. In the depth of winter, there is a hush both outside and inside. The fields are white, fires burn in cottages. The Tithe barn is still but vigilant. Farmers sleep secure, knowing their grain contributions are stored and cared for. The barnkeeper, or parson's assistant, might light the hearth as storm wind bangs doors to prevent ice or condensation. They walk aisles by lamplight, scanning for leaks or broken shingles. Sometimes, a family may come to discuss seed grain for spring planting. This too is formal small draws made from the barn stores. There is no hurry, because the barn is proof against frost and anxiety. It has weathered many winters, leaning into the wind like a great stone guardian. With the slow thaw of early spring, the barn empties. The final seed grain for planting is issued. Any accretion of old sacks or surplus moves out. Sunday sermons may reference the barn. Our obligations are stored in stone. Let us similarly store duty in our hearts, they might say. And so, with careful hum, the barn cycles back toward its spring rest sweeping begins again. Rattling keys are still ready for future duty, and the life of the structure aligns once more with human breath. The barn sleeps as fields awaken. Life and duty prepare to turn again. Through this passage of season spring stillness, summer reflection, autumn abundance, winter hibernation, the Tithe barn stands as a silent chronicle. It embodies the medieval harvest and the grace of grain preservation, the food preservation struggles before refrigeration. It lives through cycles of winnowing, of threshing, of weather and rot. It bears witness to centuries of human cooperation, sacrifice, faith, and daily ritual. And it mirrors, in its rhythms, the inhale and exhale of your own breath. Stepping into the hushed expanse of a medieval Tithe barn, one can almost sense the many hands that once touched its oak beams and flagged threshold, each participant in a slow choreography of obligation, stewardship, and quiet service. Among them is the Tithe collector, a figure both expected and yet subtly watched. In some parishes, unsalaried peasant elders performed the role. In others, it was a clerk or bailiff, appointed by a monastic house or local rector. Their duty was to gather the in-kind tithe, ensuring each sack of wheat, sheaf of barley, or bundle of wool was duly received. These tithe collectors navigated winding lanes from village to village, gently reminding families of the obligation embedded in canon and custom. They arrived in the hearth-lit cottages with little ceremony and yet great significance. Each visit marked the culmination of harvest, the beginning of accounting, and the continuation of tradition. Their presence carried both authority and routine. They were neither feared as taxmen nor celebrated as benefactors, but accepted as necessary custodians of divine and communal order. Within the silent walls of the barnkeeper tended a more domestic responsibility. This role, often bestowed upon a respected peasant or employee of a monastery, combined the practical with the custodial. The barnkeeper carried the weighty key, one of perhaps 21 in some barns. unlocking the barn door at dusk to admit weary farmers bearing their 10th share, then fastidiously locking up come morning. They oversaw the unloading of carts, controlled the scatter of straw across the threshing floor, and performed the precise art of stacking sacks in ordered bays. Barn keepers watched for squallage, patched broken louvered vents, guided cleaning efforts, and even directed the seasonal visits of owls that roosted in cross-shaped openings, welcomed for their appetite for mice and their contribution to protecting the grain. In a world of shifting weather and unstable food stocks, this quiet attention held great value. The barn keeper, as steward of both resources and ritual rhythm. Overseeing the spiritual and material life surrounding the tithe was the parish priest, or in many cases the curate, appointed to tend souls while managing receipts and distributions. Tithes, after all, funded more than barns. They supported the maintenance of the church fabric, clergy stipends, and poor relief. In larger parishes, or those whose rectory belonged to monasteries, a vicar served as deputy, carrying out day-to-day duties while remitting a share of the tithe to an absentee abbot or bishop. These priests were expected to be literate, diligent, and sensitive to both canon law and local custom. They presided over weighing rituals, marking each family's contribution in a tame ledger, with entries that were indispensable when the rights of tithes were questioned or transferred. Though they received not only the grain, but the trust of their parishioners, many priests also farmed glebe lands, parcels accompanying the rectory, ensuring a steady, if modest, income. Even a poor priest receiving 150 lambs in tithe in Hampshire in 1302 could find his flock overwhelming, requiring immediate sale, caretakers, or conversion to profit. Yet the barn and its rituals also relied on the hands of peasant families, whose daily rhythms were bound to the fields, and who upheld the tithe system through repeated, often strenuous, seasonal labor. The de Havilland family and archetype of tenant farmers arose before dawn. Their cottage was dim, warmed only by an emberside hearth. Today was tithe delivery day. In the field, dew-damp sheaves of wheat, barley, and oats, each bundled in tens and marked with a distinct rope teller of the invisible arithmetic linking earth to altar awaited Philip, Marjorie, and their children. Precise ritual and humble gestures accompanied each division. The 10th sheaf set aside for the church, the rest reserved for family sustenance, seed, and sale. Milk, wool, eggs submitted in smaller clusters or as coins for personal tithe were counted and packed with care. Their sacrifices were quiet yet full, recorded with solemn eyes and hushed reverence at the barn door. A procession followed. The cart's axles groaned, disturbed chickens scattered, and the dusty lane echoed with measured steps. Alongside the barn's massive oak portal, the collector stood waiting, key at side, duties in mind. The barn keeper directed Philip to an empty bay. Marjorie helped unfasten one tithe sack, placing it on the flagstones. A priest bent low, pried open the stitched hemp, revealed the grain's texture and smell, and weighed it with gravity, each brass pan balanced carefully until a modest measure was reached. Marjorie watched the dust drift. Her daughter Agnes looked from sack to record book. The priest jotted the de Havilland name, weighed amount, and date. A ritual of obligation silent, yet resonant with communal function and divine contract. Following the tithe, the family retraced their steps homeward. The day's labor transformed into spiritual token. The barn keeper closed the door. The night's first breeze carried the day's talisman of communal remembrance. Each family returned to hearth and supper. Small barley porridge, memories of contract fulfilled, and hearts full of quiet duty. Occasionally, the barn opened for other purposes under the watchful eye of its keeper and the community. During winter, when snow draped the land in white and wind scattered leaves through unheated lanes, barn interiors sheltered livestock. Cows milked under rafters, lambs shielded from frost. Peasants gathered to mend nets, patch harness, or sort wool. On rare feast mornings, Michaelmas or Easter, the barn might witness a gentle assembly. Readings, prayers, distributions of grain to the poor, murmured blessings at each corner. Without dramatic overture, these gatherings unfolded within calm spaces, guided by the parish curate, measured by candle time, and framed by silent structure. Occasionally, tensions surfaced. If a peasant family withheld or underpaid, ecclesiastical penalty threatened, from excommunication to communal shame, though real enforcement was rare. More frequently, modus's prearranged fixed payments emerged. These were ancient agreements precluding burden fluctuations, typically disliked by rectors, but cherished by farmers. The barn keepers and priests held the ledger, documenting each agreement, each challenge, each tacit compromise. Throughout the seasons, one visitor became especially valued: the owl. Its signature cross-shaped apertures in the barn walls served not only ventilation, but welcomed these silent hunters. Their presence reduced rodent threats, protected the harvest, and became part of the ambient hush. These living sentries, unheralded yet vital, knit the structure's purpose to nature's cycles. In monastic contexts, where the barn belonged to abbey granges, the scale of activity widened. Abbey-employed collectors and stewards arrived with ledgers and surveys, evaluating yields across multiple villages, calculating tithes for individual manors, and directing deliveries to the abbey storehouse. The tithe barn at Dunster Priory, for instance, was part of a network centered on a Grade I listed barn, which in 1535 yielded nearly 37 pounds from tithes. Such activity demonstrated the synergy of spiritual stewardship and institutional infrastructure. The barn keeper in these monastic settings was no humble peasant. Often appointed by the abbey, they managed teams of masons and carpenters during seasonal repair, coordinated the removal of overflowing sacks, and liaised with monks overseeing monasterial well-being beyond spiritual duties. Stewardship in this sense extended not only to grain and goods, but to relationships between church and village, between stone and community, between time and tradition. Underneath each role lay the echo of purpose: the tithe collector ensuring the system's fidelity, the barn keeper safeguarding the material deposit, the parish priest embodying spiritual anchor, the curate bridging monastic obligation and pastoral care, the peasant family translating land into legacy, the owl and winter sheep weaving life into structure. Within the barn's stillness, these threads formed a tapestry of medieval society, each silent worker both singular and sacred. Even after the dissolution of the monasteries, when Henry VIII redistributed abbey lands, these roles morphed, but their essence lingered. Lay impropriators, local gentry, or merchants took on tithe rights, retained barnkeeper roles, sometimes hiring curates to replace displaced monks. In the 17th century, some barns acquired fireplaces and mullioned windows as barnkeepers stayed through chill nights. Others became stables or dwellings, lowering rents or raising opportunity. Even in transformation, the tithe barn remained a human hub, a structure adapting to human rhythms, not solely the reverse. Through these transitions, continuity remained in roles and rituals. The tithe collector still came to collect, even if the produce turned into cash. The barn keeper still held the key, now also balancing grain against congregational need or private sale. The priest, curate, or new lay rector still depended upon the tithe-derived income, though glebe lands and tithes increasingly separated as late as 1836. Peasant families adapted too, paying in coins or negotiating lotus. Yet the fundamental pattern endured. A family works the soil, offers sacrificial tenth. Village acknowledges obligation. Barn absorbs duty. Barn keeper ensures safekeeping. Priest chronicles offering. Owl and winter shadow lend silent witness. As dusk falls on the barn's present-day ruins or restored arches, it is these roles we feel echoing within. Even empty stalls recall cartwheels. Quiet rafters resonate with low voices counting sacks. In imagination, one can see the heartlit exchange. Grain flows in, trust flows back. These quiet participants, tithe collector, barn keeper, priest, peasant, formed a living mechanism, revolving around communal duty and spiritual sustenance. So, let your breath soften as you picture the barn door at dusk, closing on another day of quiet labor. The barn keeper locks the last bolt. The tithe collector walks down the lane as night gathers. The priest removes his ledger, dips his quill, and extinguishes one candle. The peasant family returns to hearth and rest, satisfied duty has been done. The owl perches once more, watching over silent sacks of wheat beneath the roof and stars. In that hush, the barn breathes, a living memory built by many hands, born of purpose, sustained by custom, ready to stand through centuries of quiet service. The centuries have worn like gentle breath across the stone and timber of tithe barns, each edifice shaped by time's patient erosion. In the medieval world, these barns arose to shelter the church's 10% tax, rising from fields and granges in echo with axes and chisels. But as the centuries advanced, their purpose diminished, and the barns fell silent. Walls, once unwavering, began to crumble. Roofs lost laths and slates. Beams sagged, softened by damp and insects. Yet this decay was not the end. From this quiet unraveling sprang an unexpected continuity, decay, and renewal entwined in a slow dance. Each restoration a testament to the enduring sense of communal identity bound to these ancient buildings. In this chapter, we trace their decline, the rise of heritage consciousness, and the patient act of renewal that preserves not merely stone, but memory. By the 16th century, a profound shift had begun. The dissolution of the monasteries stripped abbeys of their land and influence. Tithe barns, once bustling with seasonal deliveries of grain and livestock by parishes and tenants, lost their primary custodians. Some were sold, subdivided, or repurposed into farm buildings. Others were abandoned. Over time, roofs collapsed. Walls were quarried for new stone. Roof timbers, once part of lofty cruck trusses or raised aisled halls, lay fallen and rotting. Floors sunk. Doors, once grand portals for laden carts, were smashed or removed. The air inside grew still and cold. Bats moved in. The barns stood mute, shells of former vitality. In places like Ashelworth in Gloucestershire, a 15th century tithe barn, standing by the banks of the Severn, was gradually converted after the dissolution to house livestock cows, hay, occasional grain. But damp accumulated in its blue lias stone walls. By the mid-20th century, the barn's stonework deteriorated, particularly its buttresses, weakened by weather and root damage. Only rare maintenance was undertaken, and its heavy stone-tiled roof began to leak. In 1956, the National Trust acquired the property, but only in the 2020s did a careful conservation plan begin. Surveys of local bat populations, common pipistrelles, soprano pipistrelles, and long-eared brown bats preceded mortar, repointing, and stone replacement. Even the new mortar mix had to be approved by heritage organizations, as must every alteration to this scheduled monument. The barn's slow decay paused and began its slow renewal, not just structurally, but ecologically, as human stewardship adapted to the natural occupants within. Elsewhere, the story was similar. At Bradford-on-Avon in Wiltshire, a tithe barn built in the early 14th century passed through private hands. In 1914-15, Wiltshire Archaeological Society, concerned that the weight of its stone-tiled roof was pushing outward the walls, raised an appeal. Decayed timbers were replaced. The barn avoided collapse, feathering new oak into old frames, repairing buttresses, fitting iron cross ties to contain outward thrust. Each action steadied the barn's anatomy. In the 1950s, the Ministry of Works took over, performing significant repairs. But neglect resumed. By the 1980s, the barn again required underpinning and tie rods under the weight of its original roof. Its interior structural integrity fragile, but its monumentality preserved. In Somerset, at Dunster, a 14th century tithe barn, once part of a Benedictine priory, also fell into neglect. By the late 20th century, its suspended elm threshing floor had been lost. Roof timber sat on rotten foundations, and graffiti from 1827 streaked the west wall. Local community groups rallied. In 2006, a 5-year restoration began, guided by the Somerset Buildings Preservation Trust and Heritage Lottery funding. Ancient details, mason's marks, original beams were retained, while the barn was repurposed as a village community hall. By balancing old and new, the barn was given fresh life. Today, echoes of medieval tacks come only in name, but the structure breathes in weekly gatherings, fairs, weddings, its walls holding memory as firmly as they once held grain. Perhaps the most compelling recent renewal comes at Upminster, Greater London. This medieval grange barn, built about 1450, had suffered wartime neglect, fire, and age. By 2023, it was listed on Historic England's Heritage at Risk Register. Master thatchers replaced its aging roof of Turkish water, read some. 11,000 bundles in a project financed by National Highways and Historic England, totaling around £750,000. Roof timbers felled in the 14201-440 era were sympathetically repaired or supported after years of compromise by concrete posts. Earlier mistaken efforts meant to stave off rot. Scaffoldings ringed the structure. Tanks anchored them against wind. Bat surveys secured ecological compliance, and local school children buried a time capsule in its ridge. In June 2025, restoration was completed, and the barn was removed from the at-risk register. Where once grain was housed, now history, education, and heritage will fill its vast interior. Pilton's Tithe Barn offers another odyssey of decay and rebirth. Attributed to the 14th century and long thought to serve Glastonbury Abbey, it burned in 1963. Abandoned, its stones scattered until Michael Eavis, founder of the Glastonbury Festival, purchased and gifted it to the Pilton Barn Trust. With generous funding from festival profits and English heritage, a reconstruction began. Old beams overlain with new oak, crafted by Peter McCurdy, scaffolding assembled, blue lias stone flooring and lime concrete laid, possibly Europe's largest such floor. In 2005, the restored barn opened as a venue for public events, earning Wood Awards and Reba prizes. Pilton's barn exemplifies how a community's cultural memory, represented by ancient stone and timber, can be reactivated through sensitive renewal. In Belgium, at Terduist Abbey near the Zouige, a 1375 grange barn underwent an exemplary restoration. Timber degradation by beetles and moisture reached a critical point. A Europa Nostra recognized project inventoried 3,200 timbers, replacing only those rotten with green oak, maintaining authenticity. Stonework was carefully repointed with lime. Bricks were replaced as needed. Some 32,500 original roof tiles were removed, restored, and reinstalled intact. The work preserved the Cistercian barn's medieval character in a maritime climate, showing once again that deep respect for craft traditions sustains centuries-old architecture. Renewal need not entail full-scale restoration. At Ashelworth and other barns within National Trust stewardship, phased conservation, such as repairing stone buttresses in 4 stages, balances built heritage with habitation, particularly for resident bats. A sliding scale of renewal ensures these buildings remain standing, safe, and secure, even as their original function has vanished. Underlying these efforts is a shift in philosophy. In the early 19th century, the Tithe Commutation Act replaced tithe in kind with monetary payments, removing the need for tithe barns. Many became redundant, some demolished. But by the 20th century, a growing heritage consciousness emerged. Architects, historical societies, trusts, and local communities began to rediscover the architectural genius of cruck trusses, raised base aisles, triple purlin roofs, and cross-vaulted stone buttresses. They saw in neglected barns not relics, but reservoirs of cultural memory structures that could connect present to past, community to craft. Thus, Decay created an opportunity for renewal. The heritage champions who stepped forward, archaeologists, timber framers, thatchers, engineers, community volunteers, embraced the challenge. Many efforts sought to integrate sustainability, using lime mortar, stone from local blue lias quarried by skilled masons, rainwater harvesting systems, bat roost preservation, low-impact scaffolding, and educational programs. The result: tithe barns that now host markets, exhibitions, weddings, lectures, folk festival spaces where community gathers under vaulted timber, fragments of grange shadows lingering in the stone. In Dunster, the barn seats 100. In Upminster, it welcomes visitors again. In Pilton, it hums with festival energy. In Terduist, it showcases monastic construction techniques. This process has significance beyond architectural conservation. It acknowledges the barn's symbolic weight. They were built not for grandeur, but duty. They materialized a 10% tax, a faith-based economic pact linking each farmer to the parish. When monastic dissolution severed that link, the barns lost their raison d'etre. But in preserving them, modern communities reclaim a fragment of medieval social contract renewal through remembrance, continuity through craft, restoration through communal will. Of course, renewal is never static. Historic England, National Trust, Somerset Trust, local parish councils and villagers each continue to monitor for water ingress, timber beetles, mortar failure, structural shifting. The Upminster roof will need rethatching in 60 years. Pilton's oak beams must be inspected periodically. The Holland Lissoig timbers are continually checked. In many cases, living species bats, owls, are now part of maintenance considerations. Conservation includes habitat, and bats sharing respiration cavities becomes as vital as protecting medieval stone. As we step back from these iterative acts of repair, we see that decay and renewal are not opposites, but complement. Each barn stone wall bears lichen and century lines. Each beam holds not whole memories. But when renewal engages authenticity-matching stone type, reusing traditional lime mortar, employing the same carpentry techniques, then structure and soul remain intact. These barns become palimpsests, marks of medieval duty overwritten by modern care, yet preserving all earlier layers of time. In the quiet dusk of one restored barn, the air feels still, but within the walls live centuries of echo. You sense the arch of a cruck truss above, supporting the space of grains and ledgers. You glimpse a beam hewn by a medieval axe, later replaced by a modern saw. You hear the soft footfall of visitors, half for history, half for resonance. The barn pulses again, not as a tax store, but as a vessel for memory, community, and craft. At Pilton, the barn's mid-1960s fire could have ended its story. Instead, renewal allowed it to open to festival culture. At Upminster, risk listings spurred funding that saved a barn near demolition. In Brittany's Belgium, monastic barn fabric remained intact through careful restoration of each rafter. In Ashelworth and Bradford, incremental repair has extended their life by centuries. Across Europe, from monastic barns of the 14th century to rural museums of the 21st, the arc of decay and renewal renders a gentle meditation on stewardship. As our chapter softly closes, imagine yourself in a quiet barn after restoration, the floor freshly swept, light washing across stone walls, a faint scent of lime mortar and oak, a visitor's distant murmur. Outside, wind enters through cross-shaped louvers. A bat flits under a beam. The barn stands poised between past and future, between timber decline and renewal. It is a place not merely of architecture, but of living heritage of barns that remember the church tithe and of people who remember them. Let your breath slow in the hush of this renewed space. Let the memory of decay sink deep and the quiet resolve of renewal settle softly. In each beam, each stone, each repaired joint lives the promise that even as purpose fades, meaning endures. This barn restored holds both decay's record and renewal's hope. Slowly, as the day's light drifts away, imagine once more stepping across the threshold of a grand medieval tithe barn, its heavy doors closing behind you with a soft thud. You pause and feel the cool hush wrap around your shoulders, a quiet testament to centuries of obligation fulfilled. Within these walls, built to shelter the church's 10% tax, every stone, every timber still holds memory. The barn, in its stoic presence, becomes a vessel of time-absorbing footsteps, harvests, sermons, decisions, and even silence. As the world outside dims, the barn remains an anchor of continuity. Its function may have shifted, its tenants changed, from peasants to clerks, monks to modern romantics, but the spirit of purpose endures. These barns began as practical solutions, storage buildings for predial, mixed, and personal tithes rendered to the church. Yet over centuries, they transcended mere functionality. They became statements of architecture and ambition, tangible markers of community faith and economic duty. Take Great Coxwell Barn, for example, erected around 1292 by Beaulieu Abbey in Oxfordshire. Its monumental stone walls, soaring 48-foot roof ridge, and Gothic aisles made even William Morris describe it as noble as a cathedral. More than 700 years later, standing under a vaulted timber canopy and the hush of Stonesfield slate, visitors sense that same quiet dignity. Pilton Barn, by contrast, suffered ruin in the 1960s, but was lovingly restored in 2005, thanks to heritage grants and the care of local custodians. Its reconstructed cruck trusses and 30,000 handmade roof tiles won architectural awards. The barn, once serving Glastonbury Abbey, now hosts small concerts and village gatherings. Dunster Tithe Barn, once part of a Benedictine priory, is another paragon of communal rebirth. After a £550,000 renovation funded by heritage trusts, it now beats with new life as a community hall. Across England, barns like Ashelworth have been cared for with both history and nature in mind, balancing the stone's integrity with the needs of roosting bats and nesting wildlife. In each restored barn, the crackle of heritage funding and community effort resonates within the beams. These structures once stored 1/10 of the harvest grains and wool, milk and apples for monastic use or ecclesiastical authority. The Tithe Commutation Act of 1836, which replaced payments in kind with monetary tithes, rendered many of the barns obsolete. Yet instead of fading into fields of ruin, a network of local societies, heritage trusts, and volunteers took up the mantle of care. Their dedication echoes the monastic stewards who first counted and recorded the tithes, suggesting that obligation can evolve into stewardship and celebration. Walking inside one of these barns today, you feel a conversation across time. The brush of wind through narrow air slits brings whispers of medieval chants, the soft echoes of flails beating grain across limestone threshing floors. Sunlight filters through cross-shaped windows and lofty gables, cast by decorated finials, carving latticed patterns of light on worn stone surfaces. The auditory historian in your imagination hears the measured exchange. Here are 9 sacks of wheat and 1 for the tithe. The architectural historian discerns the triple purlin roof, cruck trusses, stone buttresses, and heavy aisle framing, all working in quiet harmony. The conservation advocate sees centuries of decay reversed, centuries of communal effort brought forward into modern life. Yet across the quiet grandeur lie stories of loss and recovery. Some barns remained undisturbed for centuries. Others were converted or dismantled. Great Coxwell's west doorway, for example, was bricked up in the 18th century and later used as a stable with a cart shed appended to its perimeter. Its return to heritage use required a faithful restoration by National Trust volunteers, including oak beam treatments against beetles and sensitive masonry repairs. Pilton Barn's journey is more dramatic. Built in the 14th century, roofed in thatch, and struck by lightning in 1963, it stood as ruin until the Glastonbury Festival's Michael Eavis purchased it in 1995, restored its medieval cruck structure, and reimagined its purpose as a village venue. Today, its interior hums with music festivals, weddings, and local dances. An unexpected but fitting next chapter for a barn that once held kernels of harvest. Dunster's Barn is another luminous example of repurposing. After centuries of agricultural use, it was transformed into community halls, through a collaboration of county trusts and heritage funds, keeping its cruciform plan while renewing its structural legacy. Ashleworth's stewardship has even factored in ecological preservation. In caring for bats roosting among centuries-old beams, caretakers acknowledge that these barns are living habitats as well as historical structures. Throughout the British countryside, the legacy of these medieval barns is still visible and audible if you listen. They speak of grain and giving, of medieval obligation and communal faith. But they also whisper of resilience, of human hands that build and rebuild, of timber joints and stone clamps that survive wind and rain, of modern crowds gathering in sacred spaces repurposed for joy. Much like their original use to bind community through daily ritual and seasonal rhythm, they continue to shape collective identity, albeit in different ways. Pause and inhale. You might taste the faint tang of limestone, feel the hum of midday warmth on stone flags. At dusk, bats and owls drift through small openings, their presence a living continuum from medieval pest control to modern ecological awareness. Mastodon beams overhead bear the strain of modern LED lights or the echoing footfall of late-night concerts. Yet through centuries, the barn stands, sustained by its size and the care of those who inherit its purpose. Declaring goodnight in such a place feels intimate. You settle on a bench, surrounded by memories. You hear the warp and weft of community hands binding bundles of wheat, cart wheels rolling through thresholds, clerks reciting weights and names. These stones have witnessed births and deaths, drought and feast, war and harvest. Each repair and restoration is a small ritual in itself, echoing the medieval rite of tithing, binding present to past. As we close the heavy doors on this tale, feel the equilibrium in your breath. The story of the Tithe barn moves from medieval obligation to modern preservation. The architecture of obligation has become architecture of memory. The aisled barn built to hold 10% now holds in its walls the echo of hope, change, community, devotion, and rest. Sleep now beneath this vaulted timber canopy. In the quiet dark, the barn stones pulse gently with centuries of breaths. Monks, farmers, stewards, visitors. You are part of that echo. As your eyelids drift, the barn watches over you, just as you watched it. Its weight is calm. Its presence is kindness. Good night.